Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be painting up a dragon scale cloak. Looks very complicated, but it's actually very easy. I'm going to walk you through each step. The first and most important thing we need is a good candidate for a technique like this. We are going to be painting a heavy texture over our surface, our cloak in this case, so we need a surface cloak that is relatively flat and smooth. This particular cloak is flat in the sense that it doesn't have a whole bunch of tight folds. It does have a huge curl in it, which is going to pose a little bit of a difficulty when it comes to the actual painting, but it doesn't have a whole bunch of tight little folds that are going to disappear when we paint our texture onto the cloak. Now we could begin the painting, and we want to start with a good contrasting undercoat color. This is going to be the skin between the scales that we're going to paint. Black is a good color. I decided to go with charred brown here, a very dark brown. You can also use something like, white or off-white or something like that, as long as it contrasts well with whatever color scales you plan on painting. Next, we paint our scales. The shape of the scales is completely up to you. You can do something very tight and make the scales very close to each other. You can do like rectangles, you can do circles, you can even do an overlapping pattern that's getting a bit more complex. In this case, I am doing what I do best and just painting blobs. This is a rather large cloak, so decided to go for very large scales in the center, and then they go smaller as we get towards the sides of the cloak. At this stage, you want to paint relatively clean, which I am doing a terrible job of here. At this moment, I'm just trying to get a sense of where I want the scales and their exact shape. So, main thing I'm trying to do here is not have the scales touch. If they do, it's not a big deal. We'll fix that later. But try to give a little bit of space between each of your scales. As we get towards the end of this first stage, you can see we're starting to fill out the scales. They're looking a little bit better now. Still pretty messy, but at least we are covering up our charred brown and layering in our scales. That's the important part right now. By the way, I am using Vallejo Medium Blue for this stage. It's a color that I picked specifically. I wanted a blue dragon scale cloak, but I also want to use a color that's going to cover well, because this is our base coat. We're not starting at the shade layer and building up. So we need a base coat color that will cover fairly well in one, maybe two coats. So trying to do this with red, especially over a dark color, you're going to have problems. Try to pick a color that you know covers well. Next, we are going to begin our highlights, and we're going to do that simply by adding white to our medium blue. Throughout this process, and there's going to be about 5 stages, we're going to add white more and more at each stage. And we're not only just highlighting the scales here, each individual scale, but we are adding depth to each scale as well. As we go through this process, each layer is going to add more contrast and make the scales pop out a little more. This is basically pretty much the exact same thing as painting a canvas, where you use colors to create depth on a flat surface. We are doing the exact same thing here. From here on out, the process is fairly simple. We just add more and more white for each stage. I'm going to speed through these a little bit just to give you an idea of the concept, and also I think actually speeding up here will be more beneficial as you see more of the depth start appearing on our cloak, and all those little scales really start to pop as we add each additional highlight. For our highlights, we are applying those mostly to the top side of each scale. You can see for the first highlight started off with kind of highlighting half of the scale, and then each successive highlight we move higher and higher up on the scale. Now I do have a little bit of problem on this specific figure because of the big billow in the center of the scale. So I had to change the direction of some of the highlights. So at the top of that fold right going down the center, you can see that I highlighted towards the bottom of the scale there on certain scales, and then the top on the other side. The scales under the big fold on the left, they don't need any highlighting at all. Those are all in shadow. So I'm having to make adjustments based on the shape of our cloak. This is example why I said at the beginning a flat surface cloak is a much easier surface to work upon. For each successive highlight, you can see I'm starting off on the very edge of the scale, and then I'm deciding how much to work it down, which is actually how I normally do highlighting. You start at the highest highlight area of the miniature, and then you bring it down to however low you think that highlight should go. That prevents you from messing up if you start putting the highlight in too low of an area and then realize it is too low. It's hard to fix. Here, I always know I'm going to repaint over the area I began with. As we get to our fifth and final highlight, we're using almost pure white at this point, and this final highlight really ramps up the amount of white in the mixture because we want a nice hard edge on our scale to really make it pop from that charred brown background. Also, you may notice that our scales are looking much cleaner now because as I was applying the highlights, I was smoothing out some of the roughness of the scales. Not every area, and I did screw up the location on some of the highlighting, but it is looking cleaner now, and we'll clean it up a little bit more later on. Now that we are done with our highlighting, we can go to our shadows. For that, I am going to layer in some Vallejo Model Color Violet. This is going to add a little violet to our blue scales, give them a nice sort of color change. And you can do this two different ways. In this case, I'm mainly doing it for shadow. Again, because we have this very billowing cloak, I need to add shadow. Also, again, adding a little bit of color to each of the scales adds more contrast, adds more depth to each of the scales. So I'm doing this for shade. You can also just do it as a glaze to add a little bit more color and interest to your scales. Either way, as long as you add more color, it's always a good thing. For our second shade, once again, I am using violet. Same mixture as I used before, I'm just putting on an additional coat. Because this color is so dark, I don't have to mix up anything darker. So the violet is all we need, and just a little extra touch here and there is enough shade. And then finally, we get to our cleanup stage. Always an important stage, whatever project you're doing. When I said earlier, don't be too concerned if you screw up, well, that's because we are doing this. Now I am getting a nice sharp edge on all of our scales. The areas that we highlighted should be pretty sharp because, well, we highlighted them repeatedly. So this is the other areas. I'm trying to separate the scales. Some are touching now, just cleaning up any rough spots, just going around with our camo black brown and cleaning up as needed. Now, the smart people out there might be saying, wait, didn't he start with charred brown? Yes, well, that's my screw up. I should be using charred brown here, but I forgot what I initially base coated our cloak with. So we're going with camo black brown. Colors are close enough. It'll be fine. Don't worry. Normally, when painting a dragon cloak, at this stage I would be done, but because I went with more kind of haphazard blob-shaped scales, I had a lot of camo black brown areas left, so I decided to actually spice up our in-between scale area a little bit with some highlighting. A little mix of beastie brown and camo black brown, and then straight beastie brown, just to add a little bit more interest to spice up those just plain, very dark areas, make them look a little bit more interesting, and mainly concentrating this on the larger areas. Not only are those more plain, but it's also much easier to get a brush into those. And then we finish off with a final highlight between our scales with some game color leather brown. By the way, you may notice that the other side of the cloak that I've completely ignored through this video, I thought I recorded that part, but I couldn't find it. I just stippled some browns on that side, but that's actually very important that I went with browns there. You can go with any color you want, but I'm taking the brown that's in between the scales and then wrapping it around the miniatures. And I just stippled on a few different browns to give some texture and make that area a little bit interesting. Not as interesting as the back, but at least a little bit eye-catching and not just plain and boring. And there we go, one dragon scale cloak. Hopefully you see, as you look at something that looks complicated like this, when you break it down into steps, it's actually very easy. All we did was highlight and shade our scales, and that's basically it. It is a little time consuming, but mostly that's the first few steps, the highlighting. As you get up there and start with your final highlights, you're painting over a smaller surface area, so you have less to do. This particular cloak with the big fold down the center also meant I had to change the direction of the highlighting, which made it a little bit more difficult. That's why I say, once again, if you have something flat and smooth, that's the best thing to practice with. This is a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. So that is it. Why don't you try painting your own scaly cloak? All you have to do is paint dots. Lots of dots. More dots. Thank you for watching and subscribing, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
This baby can handle everything but a three-headed Oh, son of a... Oh.